Yeah, I haven't done anything on the Bronze Age area of my base. I better fix that. Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it'd be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're again on the Archaeo SMP, and we're going to be working on the Bronze Age area around my base. This is an area I haven't touched yet, so what do you suppose I should build? Well, I decided it might be fun to build from a civilization that was pretty much lost to history, but was once one of the great powers in the Mediterranean and Near East during its time, even being a rival to Babylon and Egypt. And who was that? The Hittites. In this episode, I'm going to go over in broad strokes who the Hittites were, talk through their history, and then build a couple of Hittite structures that I'm going to incorporate into my base here on Archaeo SMP. To be clear, some of these structures I'm going to try and copy from actual archaeological buildings unearthed during excavations, but others I'll be creating to show the archetypical structural themes for that type of Hittite building. So I'm going to identify which is which as I walk you through each build. I'm also going to say right out of the gate here that this video will be a two-part video, so it doesn't get too long. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. The Hittites were a civilization that existed during the Bronze Age from around 1700 BC through till its downfall and almost complete erasure from human history during the Bronze Age collapse around 1180 BC. I'll get to that downfall a bit later, but the timeline of Hittite history has been divided into different periods following the different dynastic kingship lines. These periods are the Old Kingdom, which dates from around 1650 BC to 1500 BC, the Middle Kingdom, which dates from around 1500 BC to around 1430 BC, and then what's either referred to as the New Kingdom or the Hittite Empire period, which dates from around 1400 BC to around 1200 BC. You may notice I gave pretty rough dates, and that's because in my research, a number of sources gave different dates for the different periods, and there seems to be some academic disagreement with regards to exactly where to draw these lines, so I gave them in real rough categories. The Hittites' name from themselves was the Hatti, and their name for their language they spoke was the Nesili, meaning the language of Nessa, perhaps named after the city of Nessa, which was an important political center in Anatolia. Oh, and a quick note in case you haven't heard the term Anatolia, that's mostly the geographic area of modern-day Turkey or Turkey. Okay, back to the Hittite language. The Hittite language was written using a cuneiform script, a writing system borrowed from Mesopotamia, but the script was adapted and utilized the Hittite language. Scholars believe that this script was introduced to the Hittites through Assyrian markets operating in their cities. The Assyrians being another great ancient civilization to the Hittites south and east. Originally, the Hittites were a collection of independent city-states prior to the Old Kingdom period. These city-states were unified under the leadership of King Hattusili I, who became the first ruler of the Hittite capital, Hattusa, after he took control over that city-state, and then he unified the rest of all of those city-states, as I said. His reign marked the beginning of Hittite expansion into neighboring regions as well, including Syria, where he besieged the city of Aleppo, though he wasn't able to completely capture the city. His successor, who was his grandson, Mursili I, who came to the throne in either 1595 or 1587 BC, was able to finally take the city of Aleppo. He also later in his reign led a great raid down the Euphrates and sacked Mari as well as Babylon itself, but turned the cities over to local allies instead of directly incorporating it into the Hittite territory, and headed back to Anatolia as he was fearful of rebellion. He was probably right in thinking that, as he was assassinated by his brother while making his way back to Anatolia and Hittite territory. Over the extent of Hittite history, the empire expanded and contracted like this and had frequent bouts of political infighting, assassination, coups, and the like, and generally had issues with stable successions. It was in around 1500 BC when the Old Kingdom ended, and then the next Hittite period called the Middle Kingdom started. This lasted the better part of the following century until around 1430 BC. The Middle Kingdom was generally a time of weakness for the Hittites, where they fended off aggressors to their north, particularly from the Black Sea coast, specifically the Kaskians. Speeding through the Hittite historical timeline, as I mentioned before, the Middle Kingdom led to the Hittite Empire period, and it was during that period that they created the innovation of formal treaties and alliances, and they were probably the first people to do so. This period in Hittite history saw the strengthening of the kingship, where it became more of a legal position that had hereditary rules of succession norms applied to it. The beginning of the Hittite Empire period saw the capital of Hattusa relocated to Samulaha from 1400 to 1350 BC, during which Hattusa was sacked, but it was able to be moved back to Hattusa around 1350 BC. It was also at that time which saw increased conflicts with Assyria to the southeast, who made headway encroaching on Hittite territory and conquering some of their allies' cities. However, it was also during the Hittite Empire period that the Hittites saw their greatest extent of their geographical territory and political influence. Here's a map of their empire around the year 1300 BC to show what that geographical extent was, as well as you can see in the light green where some of their allies were. It was during this time that we have quite a number of written correspondences between the Hittite rulers and the other neighboring powers, particularly the New Kingdom Egyptians, who were a key rival on the southern border at that time. In one letter between the two great kings, the Hittite king spoke of sending some craftsmen, specifically some sculptors, to Egypt as a gift for the pharaoh in exchange for Egyptian healers. The Hittite ruler at that time was seemingly under the opinion that the Hittite doctors were not as good as the Egyptian ones, and asked for those doctors to be sent to Hattusa. Also, while there isn't a direct letter found between the Hittite kings and the Mycenaean Greeks, some scholars have suggested that perhaps a similar exchange of gifts in the form of artisans or skilled craftsmen might have taken place there. Some scholars have pointed out that while there are some differences between the Hittite and Mycenaean fortification techniques, there are a number of similarities between the two, leading some to speculate that there may have been a direct sharing of techniques between those two cultures. Not all communication or contact was friendly, however. One of the most famous contacts between the Egyptians and the Hittites is borne out at the Battle of Kadesh, which took place in 1274 BC. That battle saw the Egyptian armies of Ramses II face off against Mawatiya II of the Hittites. This battle was perhaps one of the largest chariot battles in history. In it, both sides fielded thousands of chariots, or so they say, and both claimed victory, but in reality it was a stalemate, which saw both sides losing a large number of their army with no definitive victor. In 1258 BC, the Treaty of Kadesh was signed and locked the mutual borders between Egypt and the Hittites, with the treaty stipulating a marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramses II. After that conflict with Egypt, the Hittites were in a worse place to protect and offer military aid to their allies from the Assyrians, who were threatening their trade routes. The Hittites tried to make some headway against the Assyrians by attacking some of their territory on the island of Cyprus, but it was too little too late, as the Assyrians had taken much of their land in the Hittite heartland of Syria, as well as land in southern and central Anatolia. The death blow to the Hittites came in the form of the Sea Peoples around 1150 BC. The Sea Peoples were at the heart of an event called the Bronze Age Collapse, which saw the major civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East collapse as the Bronze Age transitioned to the Iron Age. Now, I've just massively oversimplified that transition and the decline of the Hittites, and it was way more complicated than that, with famine, plagues, mass migrations of people, economic collapses, and climate change all playing parts, with most of the great powers of their time falling and being taken over by new cultures and civilizations. As it relates to the Hittites, however, that Bronze Age collapse event saw the Hittite capital of Hattusa burned to the ground, much of the previous Hittite territory and peoples being taken over by the Assyrians and other Anatolian states, and the Hittites vanishing from the pages of history until the modern era, with only scant references to their existence. Some of the few places that they were mentioned in historical record that did persist were in the Old Testament of the Bible and in some Egyptian records. Okay, so while I've been going on about the history of the Hittites, you've been watching me build this little mock city in our Minecraft base. You can see I marked out some of the foundations of the buildings I plan to build and discuss in part 2, but what I finished are the city walls. While I've made these walls to scale from a depth perspective, so from front to back, and was detailed in how I constructed them and out of what specific material, and I'll go into that a little bit later, it isn't clear archaeologically how high the city walls were, as all of what have been found in excavations are their foundations, and only in some cases are there pictorial examples of what these structures might have looked like. So to be clear, the height is a best guess, but the walls and tower depth, how they were constructed, and what materials I've used to construct them, I've tried to be as accurate as possible. Likewise, This comes to looking kind of like a Hittite castle a little bit, and not maybe like a whole city with city walls, but the city walls of Hattusa were either 48 or 75 hectares early in its history, or by the Hittite Empire period, were a total of 180 hectares of enclosed space. So clearly that isn't a scale that I'm going to be able to achieve here in Minecraft. That would be about 1.8 million square blocks or meters. As such, I've made these city walls big enough to fit the other buildings I wanted to build, but really no bigger than that. So thus why it comes off looking a little bit like a Hittite castle. The Hittite city walls were built on hills or mountainous rocky outcroppings, and the walls followed the existing terrain. As you see in my video here, I started with some pretty flat ground, but again, I gotta fit this build within my Minecraft base, so I had to make some Minecraft-like adjustments. The walls themselves had foundations of stone on top of which logs were laid. The wall structure was made of mud bricks with additional wooden structures for support where needed. The whole of the wood and mud brick structure was covered with plaster to help with waterproofing. Walls were supported by placing towers at standard intervals that stuck out from the outside of the wall, which gave defenders the ability to look back over the walls themselves. Both the towers and the walls had mud brick crenulations at the top in these interesting triangle pointed shapes, as you can see in this picture, which I'm popping up on screen here. The walls were between 3.5 and 8 meters thick, depending on what the topography dictated, and were built with either casements or castenmauers, which joined together the outer and inner portions of the wall. What are those? Well, you see here they're the outer and the inner portions of the wall, and then between those portions are square or rectangle chambers that help connect the outer and inner portions. With a casement, that is left open and historically would often be a place that was used for storage or for city inhabitants to live right within the city wall itself, like a city wall apartment complex. With a castenmauer, those inner squares or rectangle areas were infilled with sand, gravel, stone, and rubble, making the wall a quite dense and resistant structure. Defenders could walk on top of the walls and would use ladders to get up the walls and up to the towers. Some towers had rooms within them, but others were infilled in a similar manner as the walls. Between some of the towers would have been gates that allowed traffic to and from the city. The gates appear to have been colored with a reddish stone and were decorated. At Hattusa, the gates were decorated with sphinx, lions, or armed deities, and the gateways between the gates had corbelled arches with door pins that were carved into the stones of the gates themselves. One interesting type of gate, which I'll admit confuses me a bit, are called postern gates. Postern gates are corbelled tunnels covered with an earthen rampart that runs under the city walls. 12 of these type of gates have been found beneath the old Hittite era walls, and 71 postern gates have been found under the walls at Urkapi, another Hittite city. Now, the thing that confuses me is why would the Hittites go through all of the trouble to build these immense and protective city walls just to have a bunch of gates that allow travel under the walls? Well, based on what scholars have said that I found in my research, they say that the purpose is so the Hittite army could rush out to attack a besieging army. But in my mind, that seems completely counterintuitive. If a pathway can allow a Hittite army to storm out to attack the enemy quickly, what would stop the attacking enemy from focusing its efforts on those points to storm into the city? Though perhaps because of the narrowness of those underground passageways, it was easy for the defenders to block up those postern gates if they weren't going to sally forth on the offensive. Clearly they must have served a purpose, as these are at numerous Hittite cities, and generally people don't waste time building something if there isn't a good function for it. Okay, so let me talk a bit about the stone construction techniques used in these walls. The stone used to create the foundations were roughly sized for 2 to 3 people to pick up and maneuver in place. Some were a little larger than that, but most of them were about the size for 2 to 3 people to pick up. These sites date to before the invention of pulleys or cranes, and so dirt ramps would have been used, as well as wagons, animals, or placing logs under the stones to help roll them into place and get them into position. Then these stones were shaped with stone hammers with a stone type like diorite that would be harder than the rock they were trying to shape. This was because, remember, this is the Bronze Age, and so iron was in very limited supply, mostly coming from meteorites, and bronze is generally too soft to be used as an effective hammer. thus stone hammers, which would leave these distinctive and easy to identify white strike marks on the stone. Holes were drilled into the stones using quartz sand as a friction point, and sometimes bronze saws were also used where needed to cut stones to fit into place, also with the help of leveraging quartz sand. So this quartz sand is an abrasive element. So imagine for a moment you're going to be using a bronze drill or a bronze saw and then rubbing that back and forth on the stone. But remember, bronze is softer than that stone in most cases, so that quartz is used as an abrasive element so that as you're dragging that saw back and forth, we're actually using the quartz to cut or to drill as opposed to the actual item itself. Within the drill holes would be placed a thick bronze pin or peg to help hold those stones together in place. So think about the pegs that maybe hold together IKEA furniture. Bronze pegs would also be used to hold the logs in place on top of the stone foundations as well. And on top of that would go mud bricks and plaster, as I mentioned before. Okay, so we talked through an overview of the Hittite historical periods from its rise from city-states through to its imperial height to its decline and downfall, and also built the city walls. But this episode's getting a little bit long. Certainly if I would build the rest of these, it would be long. So this is where I'm going to call it for now. In the next episode, we're going to continue working through this recreation and build some of the internal buildings, the foundations of which you saw I placed here, and what archaeologists have excavated at Hittite cities. I put a whole bunch of links, as always, to articles I use to make these episodes, so please check those out if you want to learn more. Make sure you take the time to like my videos if you like and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to see more videos from builds from the Bronze Age, please check out those here on my channel. Thanks, have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.